Hey, welcome to Write More Light. My name is Sarah with the Midwest Writing Center. The way the Write More Light series tends to go is I will interview a wonderful honored guest. Then we will talk about what's up, what's new, what's hip, what's happening at the Midwest Writing Center. And then we'll go into either I will leave you with a free write, or we will have a free write live because I've got a guest today and I plan to use all of his time. I'm going to leave you with the free write. You can have a wonderful day without me doing your free write. Today's guest is Philip Goldfarb Styrt, a poet and academic, a professor at St. Ambrose University, and a super cool, super smart dude. Thank you for being here, Philip.
Thank you for inviting me, Sarah. It's really great to be here. I'm also on the board of the Midwest Writing Center, so go MWC.
Yeah, I should have added that. Thank you. I'm not going to touch on the board. That's a whole different thing. I'm particularly excited to have you here. I haven't had, I've had a few academics on. That's just the nature of the beast. A lot of writers look to make money somewhere, and the way they do that is in academia, right? We care about literature, so we learn about literature. But I haven't been able to talk to anyone about working in academia. And that's exciting for me as someone who thinks that the academy is maybe more accessible than it seems. I guess that'll be my segue question. Why is it, do you think, that the academy is so unapproachable for we laymen? I'm including me as a layman, as someone without a master's degree.
Right. So I think a lot of that is intentional, and I don't mean intentional like on my personal part that I don't want you to understand things, but I think there's sort of like a long history of it being sort of seen as beneficial to seem different and distinct and otherworldly, sort of the ivory tower stereotype, which I don't think is in many cases accurate, especially an institution like the one where I'm teaching. St. Ambrose is, a regional, fairly small Catholic institution. We're very embedded in the community. We very much want to be part of the community. So that separation is not very valuable, I think, to us. But there's a long history of, sort of the snobbery of it, which then leads itself into a lot of things like you and I were talking before the stream started about sort of the way academic writing tends to come across as being something that people really can't read, really can't relate to, because it's got sort of its own jargon and its own stuff going on. And I think that in itself is one of the biggest barriers that causes people to sort of feel like they're not in contact with, they couldn't possibly be in contact with academia. It's just that, you sit down to read something someone wrote, and first of all, it might cost you $100 to do. And then second of all, even once you get it, it's not always the most readable stuff in the world. And that's something we academics need to get better at. Now, we're usually not, unfortunately, in charge of the financial side of that, but the writing side, we certainly could, we can be more easily understood if we try.
I'm really glad you brought up money. That's, I think, probably the biggest hurdle. There it is. The biggest hurdle between who can access anything, really. But that both goes for getting into school, going to school, and also just picking up a book. There's also something I've talked to you about just a little bit in life, like journals, that lots of exciting developments are happening in academia, in research, in literature, in writing, that are still behind a paywall, even if it's a monthly journal or whatever. And I bet there's just a ton of people who don't even know about it.
Certainly, and there's both people who don't know about it in the sense of people who don't know that stuff's being done at all, and then there's people who don't know about it sort of in the opposite sense, which is if you are at an institution that gives you access to these things, then you often will sort of be like, well, of course everyone has access to it, right? I just go on to this database and the stuff is there, so why aren't other people reading it? And the answer is, Well, they literally can't. Which is not to say, by the way, if you know you're out watching us, and or if you, Sarah, want to read something by an academic, that you can't get access to it. The single easiest way to get access to an article an academic wrote is to email the academic, because we are always so excited that anyone wants to read what we have written, that you will almost certainly get a very, obviously write politely. Don't just be like, hey, bozo, give me your stuff. But, you'll almost certainly get, someone who's very pleased to be part of that conversation with you, to let you see what they've written, even if it's behind a paywall, they obviously will have a copy of it.
I'm really, really happy you said that, because you said that to me once and it sort of blew my mind. I never considered asking the author. And that's also something I've seen. There's maybe I won't name it. I don't want to ruin anyone's day, but there's a group I'm in on Facebook where people share things to which they have access, where other people who are interested or excited don't. And I think that's a really, really special thing, but also something that like you forget about the second that you step away, or you never had the opportunity to know about. I know, like, I'm trying to think of things that you see a little bit in like the undergrad world, which is still not up that ladder, but also still very far removed from someone who doesn't go into higher ed, which is like JSTOR or like an OED subscription. Those are things that I think are pretty normal in at least English literature, English/literature, that you just wouldn't know about if you weren't in higher ed at all.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is that if this is something you're interested in, and of course, that's another hurdle that academia always deals with, is, right, are we actually talking about something anyone's actually interested in? But, assuming that you are, your local libraries actually have a lot more access to that sort of thing than people tend to realize. So for instance, an OED subscription, they might not have the online subscription if you're sitting at your house, but if you go to the library, they might have one, or they'll probably have a physical OED at the very least. And interlibrary loan is a great resource that most public libraries are plugged into that system. So, there might be a fee. So again, that financial aspect can raise its head, because ILL fees can sometimes be something that at least some of which you need to cover yourself, although ideally not much of it. They're supposed to have a budget for it. But, you go to your local library. If you want to read a book that's out there in the world, they are plugged into ILL. They can get you that access. Librarians are one of our best resources in the world for getting information. And, obviously if you are, an undergrad, as you said, like, your institution probably has things. The librarians at your institution definitely have access to things. But even if you are not, if you never were, or you've graduated, or you left for some other reason, or you're, well past that stage of your life, the local library still is happy to at least try to find you access to those things. And they're usually pretty darn good at it. Also, just a complete tiny sidebar, JSTOR has recently started having like free accounts where you can access a certain number of articles. So that is something to check out. Again, if this is something that you are actually interested in accessing and don't have other resources for.
I'm really glad that you mentioned interlibrary loans and just the grand scope of what a library or a librarian can do, because I didn't realize until I had friends who were going to library school, getting an MLIS, that part of their degree is learning how to research, which is much more complicated than, I'm just going to use the word layman a lot today, than we realize. I have like an above average ability to use a search engine, but that is not what research is. So like, even if they don't have access to it, they can probably find a cheat code. Which
they're great. Here at St. Ambrose, just for an example, we teach the undergrads how to do research as part of their gen ed requirement. That's not actually taught by the faculty. That's information literacy 101. It's taught by the librarians because they really are the experts. Not that those of us who are in the academics don't know how to do it also, but we tend to know it for our sort of niche field in a way, whereas they know a lot more general skills. So again, massive plug for your local library, any library you might have access to that isn't your local library. Librarians, even remotely, are just, especially during the pandemic, of course, are more than happy to be, I guess I'm now volunteering their services, but they tend to be more than happy to help people find not just academic stuff, but really anything that you're looking at.
And one final library plug. When you're talking about libraries having like memberships or whatever, subscriptions to these other services, a lot of the time, if you have a library card, you can probably just get the library's like general login for these things. I'm trying to remember. I know I did that in Iowa City, but Iowa City is an academic town. I know and love the Davenport Public Library, but I haven't tried that.
I have also not, because I simply go over to the St. Ambrose Library where I know the librarians and just chat with them. But certainly, even if there's not sort of something they'll let you take home with you, because there's often a larger fee for the library to have that kind of access. They'll be able to access it for you, and often on the computers in the library. And of course, libraries usually have publicly accessible computers because that's another service they provide. This is just library hour now. They'll have that available for you. Cannot recommend it enough.
Sorry, I hope that wasn't too noisy. My pencil is growing dull and my nearby pen is out of ink. It's a sad metaphor there, but you've been saying lots of things that I've been taking notes about, and I'm very grateful for that. That's one of my favorite things about being able to interview people is I'm always like, oh, a thing I'm excited about. Well, luckily, being me, I get excited just to learn things. So it's an easy life to live. Okay, so I'm going to back up a bit. How did you come into academia, knowing like it's not just going to school, right? There's a whole different branching out. Like anybody can pursue higher ed in theory, but that's not the same as staying in academia.
Right. Yeah. So like a lot of people who end up going into academia, I come from a family of academics. So that is unfortunately, to be honest, one of the cheat codes for getting into academia. Not that like anyone specifically looks at your resume and says, oh, their parent was an academic, but just, the language, the culture, the world. So my mother taught geochemistry, for a number of years.
That's so cool.
My grandmother taught psychology for an even larger number of years. It is something that's passed down, through the family. But sort of practically speaking, it was a matter of being in college and realizing that the two things I sort of most wanted to do going forward were research on, in my case, Shakespeare, but on sort of a specific academic topic that I could identify, and it was even more specific than Shakespeare, and then communicating that to other people, both through writing and through teaching. One of my advisors said, this is actually in my first year in grad school, so it would have been really useful to know before I did my grad school applications, but that if you're not willing to both read and write academic articles for, not necessarily for pleasure, but sort of for something that you feel happy going and doing them, then it's going to be very difficult to go into academia, because lots of people go into academia or try to go into academia because they really like writing or because they really like reading, but they don't love the other part of it. And you have to do both a lot, which is not to say that everyone who likes to do both can do it, because there's a ton of institutional barriers. You just said, in theory, anyone can pursue higher ed. And that's, of course, as we both know, and anyone in the audience knows, not unfortunately in practice. But certainly for me, it was a matter of like, this was the only thing I could really see myself doing. And that meant that even though the odds are very high against actually getting the kind of position that I have been fortunate enough to get, tenure track position at an institution, I was willing to take that risk knowing the odds were against me, because it was really the thing I could imagine doing, because of sort of how closely all of the elements of the job, except maybe some of the bureaucratic stuff you have to do once you get the job, tracked with what I wanted to do. And then, for me, 6 years of grad school, and then 3 years of job seeking after grad school, and then I got this position here at St. Ambrose. So it was also a lot of work and a lot of patience and a small amount of tearing my hair out along the way.
The new pen I picked up was leaking. This is a great technology day for you, from the small technology to the big technology. It's fine. So I'm excited. I'm excited. And the thing that I was taking notes on here, I wanted to ask more questions about. You said it would have been great to know in advance that you need to be passionate enough or able to both read and write a lot on your particular subject. Now, I assume there is a learning curve involved with. I know there's a learning curve involved in reading academic work. I assume there's a learning curve involved with writing academic work. Can you speak to that at all? Yeah, I know it's kind of a really broad.
No, but because it's so broad, I can definitely speak to it. I do want to sort of briefly insert the caveat that, of course, that's not enough. There's a ton of other factors that you have to be fortunate enough to have lined up for you. This is one of the things that people sort of habitually get annoyed about, is people being like, "Oh, I just love reading and writing, and that's the only thing that will be necessary for it." And of course, unfortunately, that's not the case. But there's definitely a learning curve in terms of writing academic writing. And it's kind of, I would say, at least two separate learning curves sort of superimposed on each other. One of which is learning how to sort of coherently explain what you have to add to a field without sounding like you are saying that everyone else is an idiot who has ever worked in the field. It's a very fine line to draw, because I work in Shakespeare primarily, and Shakespeare died over 400 years ago.
A lot of people work in Shakespeare
since then. People have been doing Shakespeare criticism since while he was alive, arguably. So there's a big body of work out there, which means that pretty much someone will have worked on the thing that you're interested in at some point and in some way. So you need to be able to sort of differentiate what you have to add. Is it that you're bringing a new perspective because of your own experiences, so that you're bringing a new perspective because you're combining two things that other people have done which haven't been combined in this particular way? Is it that you're applying a technique someone used over here to this thing over there? What is it that you're bringing that's new, without sounding like, well, obviously everyone else should have thought of this before, and I'm the only one who understands Shakespeare, right? So that's one learning curve, and I find that people often come in at either the very low or the very high degree of differentiation. Either people come in saying, like, I am the only person who understands this line of this play, which you might be right, but probably not. Or people come in being like, there's no way I could possibly say anything new, and so all I'm going to say is just a regurgitation of what other people say. And so from either of those positions, navigating to that sort of middle ground where you can confidently say, here's the thing I've identified that I haven't seen other people do. Here's the other things they've done that are close, and here's why mine is different, not necessarily better. That's an important thing to learn how to do too, to be able to say different without having to say I'm better at it. Because again, 400 years of history, if you're like in the theology, 1,000, 2,000 years of history, you don't want to come across it as that kind of arrogant. And then the other learning curve that you have to navigate at the same time is fighting against pure academies, right? Because scholars have a bunch of sort of learned rhetorical tricks to express what they're saying. You'll read them in other people's work and you'll absorb them and you'll think through them. But a lot of them sound really jargony and don't get across what you're actually trying to say. So sort of rescuing your own voice from that, while not losing the sense of I'm still positioning myself as a scholar is really hard. And that is, I think, sort of the second wave learning curve, right? You start out by sort of focusing on, okay, how do I say something new? And then you end up finding yourself going, okay, and now how do I say something that anyone actually wants to read, like wording wise on the page? And that's the thing that I personally end up now spending most of my time on when I'm like writing and revising is I'll take paragraphs and be like, okay, I've said what I want to say, but oh my God, I can't read that. Like, and if I can't read that, no one else is going to be able to read that. So let me go back and take that paragraph and now break it down into sentences that someone could actually comprehend and understand why they should care about them. So I think that you really do have to navigate both of those learning curves for writing if you're writing in academies. Or in academic circles, I don't want to make that sound like it's impossible. I know lots and lots of brilliant writers, including writers who are much better than I am at doing this, but you do have to you see people go through these trajectories, and you do really have to go through both eventually to get good academic writing at the end.
So do you think, that's great. I was going to ask about jargon, and this leads into something else you already said. You're very good at this. You're very good at being interviewed. So do you think, because when I personally think about academic writing, and I care, I want to learn. There are things, I'm just going to not be specific at all because I'll end up like saying people's names. There are things that I've been excited to learn about, and I just can't access. I can't access their language, and I sort of had the belief, and I'm asking you if you think this is true, that there must be some kind of hierarchy to like the more academic, the more jargony the work is, it's better, versus like maybe you're like less highbrow if you have accessible language. And then I'm sure there's a divide there too between like accessible academic language and like pop nonfiction.
Right. Yeah. So I would say that that's actually less true than I expected it to be when I came into academia, which is to say
wonderful.
that I think it's not quite a bell curve because I don't think it's that regularly distributed, but I think there's sort of a sort of middle space where a lot of people end up at some point in their careers, often early in their careers. And you'd be surprised, by the way, if you look at like academic writing, academic journals, how many things are published by people who are pretty early in their careers because they're doing it desperately to get a job. That not to say that it's not valuable scholarship as well, but that there's sort of this middle space where people will want to say, I'm going to put as much jargon in here or as much theory, as many sort of code words that other people in academia understand, but people outside won't understand as I can, because that makes it legitimate. That makes it, sort of connected to this kind of academic world in a way I want to be connected. But I think actually a lot of the people whose works get more cited and more respected and so on, when you actually read their stuff, you might, as I did, go in expecting it to be very difficult. And then finding that actually it's not nearly as difficult as you expect it to be, because the people who are really good at it know it well enough that they can connect to those big ideas and those complicated ideas without having to use all of the big complicated language that often goes along with it. Now, there is definitely that distinction between sort of something written for an academic audience and something written for like a general nonfiction audience. So you'll be partly it's just the degree to which they cite other people, like because academic writing is all about the academic conversation. It's about being clear that you not necessarily have read every book that was ever published on Shakespeare. Again, that you're not going to, but
like directly referencing the intertextuality. I'm just trying to clarify. You're saying that in a more in writing that is specific for other academics, there's more direct connection to intertextuality.
Yes, not necessarily intertextuality as much as just other people who have written about this same topic. You'll be more likely to be like, and also this scholar has written about this thing that's related to my point, and then bring it in some way. Whereas in something written for a general population, you're more likely to go sort of straight to the like, here is my takeaway, without necessarily making that gesture to the other person, because the general, you might put in a bibliography, you might put in a works cited or something like that, or even in a footnote, if you're footnoting your general fiction, nonfiction rather. But the general population doesn't need to find access to that to go compare it. Whereas another academic is sort of expecting to be like, oh, I can go find this other source and compare sort of what they said, say about, Milton's book 6 of Paradise Lost, and see whether I agree. Whereas the general population might be interested in that, but if they're reading what you're reading and it's aimed at them, they probably want more of a clear through line of your thought in a different way. So they're different genres in that way, or at least that has been my general impression over time.
No, I don't know if you probably can't tell that I'm looking beyond you because you're on a screen. But my nonfiction shelf, this room that we're in is poetry and nonfiction, as far as what books are in here in my life. And I was sort of looking behind you, where I have, mixed. I've got a few categories, but not many, because it just gets complicated, of stuff that I think, or like stuff that I read in college and therefore have from valuing it, and then things that are like, sorry, I just confused Howard Zinn and Howard Bloom for a second, and that was really funny to me. But actually that, yeah. So I've got like, I have a lot of social work books. That was my first career, that are probably pretty specific, pretty jargony. But then I've got like, people's history, or Eric Larson, who are what you're going to find at a bookstore versus, I have this book I just got about modernism. That's a part of a series on modernism. Each has a like niche topic, which you're not going to find at a bookstore because it's so specific and so academic. And I had to put it down because it was not reading before bedtime reading. Yeah, no, so I'm just saying I'm excited to see your connection. And I want to give you a shout out here. I had hoped to finish your book before we came together here, and now you're just gonna have to deal with a second interview specific to your book, and we'll call it part of your press tour.
Oh no, how terrible.
But you straddle this. I'm gonna hold it up while I'm talking so that the audience can see. Shakespeare's Political Imagination by Philip Goldfarb Styrt. It's by Bloomsbury, yes?
Yeah, Bloomsbury, which runs the Arden Shakespeare, which you can see across the top there.
Arden, where's my finger? There. Arden Shakespeare. It doesn't give me a headache trying to read it. Which, God, that was a backhanded compliment. You straddle this really beautiful line between like, this is serious research stuff, and I want you to understand what I'm saying. And as someone who doesn't read, know the jargon of the industry, I'm really, really grateful for that. Also, what an interesting intersection of things. I'll not cite your introduction to your book. Would you give me the elevator pitch?
Yeah, so the elevator pitch for the book is that Shakespeare settings matter, that the places and times that Shakespeare chose to put the plays make a big difference to what's going on in the plays in a way that's specific to what people at Shakespeare's time knew about those times and places. So I spend a lot of time looking at what people did in fact know about, say, Renaissance Venice for Merchant of Venice, or ancient Rome for Julius Caesar, and then showing how an awareness of that actually changes what we might think is going on based on sort of just reading the play text without that knowledge.
Which I think, I should save this, but I'm not going to. I think is also helpful as a reader in 2022. We are reading things with the full cultural context. Like the fiction we read, I don't have any contemporary fiction near me. That's weird. This shelf next to me is like one book came out in the last 10 years, I think, if that. Let's see how old this book is.
I mean, I do have some contemporary fiction. I've got plenty of sci-fi just sitting around.
Published in 2007, not even within the last 10 years, but also a terrible example, that book, because it's beautiful vignettes by a man with a wild imagination. But the fiction that we read here and now reflects what's happening culturally here and now. And so it's pretty naive, I think, of us to read into something 300 years old, 500 years old. I know how to do math. 500 years old, with only our cultural understanding of today, and assuming we understand. So I appreciate that as someone who never thought much deeper about it.
Yeah, one of the great things about Shakespeare scholarship, and I think you can do this to anybody, but it's been done, I think, a lot in Shakespeare, is that you can still find things that are very presentist. That's the term we usually use for sort of being relevant to today. But that I think that the historical scholarship, the kind of thing I'm doing, actually deepens and sort of expands that. It doesn't make it not relevant to today. It just lets us see sort of other layers of relevance to today.
Oh, yeah, so, no, I think it expands its relevance, like you're saying, because I realize like these sorts of references are the same as what's happening now. And there's a lot of, particularly in countries that experience censorship, legal censorship, you have to veil your criticism, you have to veil your message a bit in order to make a point without getting hurt. And that's something that I personally forget about, and I think it adds a lot of depth. But I'm going to make you talk about that a lot more later when I have a better understanding of it. So how do you balance being a creative writer? You're a poet. Your poetry is featured in These Interesting Times from Midwest Writing Center Press. I actually, a while back, just like looked up your name on Twitter and found you've been publishing your poetry pretty frequently. So how do you balance being a creative writer with being a researcher, being a professor?
That's a great question. While I think about an answer, a brief shout out to another MWC current activity, which is that I'm also one of the poets for our current bespoke poems project, where you can order a poem through the MWC website, either for Valentine's Day with a deadline of, I think, today, or
today. Today is your Valentine's deadline.
Yeah, get those in, or for any occasion with a deadline of March 12th, I think it is. I actively involved in writing poetry, not just from my sort of own interest, but also what other people might ask for through that. But for me, it's actually, I think, in some ways, an easier balance for me than it is for a lot of people who are also academics and poets, of which, as you mentioned at the start of this interview, there's a lot in the world, because the kind of poetry I write is very formal poetry. I sort of fell in love with sonnets and rhymed metered poetry studying as a student, and that sort of turned into the kind of poetry I write, which means that I'm sort of always getting inspiration from the stuff I'm teaching sort of constantly. Like today I read 17th century poem Amelia Lanier's Salve Rex Deodorum, which is a poem about Christ's death, basically. And I have no interest in writing a poem about Christ's death. For a start, I'm Jewish. But I was noticing as I was going through sort of metrical things she was doing, rhyme things she was doing that were interesting, that made me sort of think about what I do myself and what I might do myself. And so a lot of my poems come not necessarily like directly out of reading other people's poetry, but sort of from the mishmash of all the other people's poetry that I literally have to read as part of my job. There are some where it is actually a much more direct line. I'm also teaching John Donne's Valediction Forbidding Mourning this week. And there's a metaphor at the end there of two compasses orbiting around each other, which I took and adapted to orbital mechanics around a star for a poem that I wrote for Prospectus magazine a couple of years ago now. And so sometimes it is very direct parallel, but usually it's more sort of like I'm just constantly absorbing poetry in my job, so therefore it has to have an outlet, so it comes out of my fingers into a keyboard and gets outputted in that way. So actually, there's a lot of synergy for me, particularly in that, and I think that there can be, if you're an academic in a way that causes you to do a lot of reading of other people's writing, that can really help inform your writing, whether that's creative or non-fictional or fiction as well, not just poetry.
Yeah, I know we do a lot of talking about how to be a better writer, you need to read, but I really don't think you can say that enough. I think that we really want to believe that you can be a fine writer as with yourself as your only I don't know, encounter. And I mean, maybe you can, but you're going to be better if you interact with other stuff. So it's really, really nice for me to hear that part of your work, working with literature helps you as a writer.
Yeah, I actually think it helps particularly to read, not so that you become a better writer, but rather just to read and let it help you become a better writer. Because the times I have tried to read people's stuff specifically because I thought I was going to get something about writing from it, with the exception of some actual writing handbooks. But like when I read like people's work being like, oh, I will be able to learn something from this person that I will be able to apply, that's usually fallen flat. It's just sort of the general attitude towards reading of doing it. I think that's helpful more than necessarily than like, oh, you should go read this person because or this kind of thing because that specifically will help you. It's more just imbibe stuff.
Totally. And I'm really glad you said that too, because I have the same experience and I don't think I would have thought of it. Where like someone I love is really excited about a writer and I'm like, cool, I'm gonna learn from this, and it's not my jam, or I'm thinking too hard about it and I'm not absorbing anything. Where the things that I learn from the most are the things that I'm just excited to read.
Yeah, and honestly, I've learned some things about writing from people whose writing my writing does not in any way resemble. So for instance, I have a colleague here at St. Ambrose, Dr. Emily Kingery, who's also on the Midwest Writing Center board, also a friend of yours, whose poetry looks nothing like mine. I literally, I once sat down trying to write something like in an imitation of her, and I cannot do it. But I still learned things about like imagery and, sort of how to surprise a reader from her that, it wouldn't work to be like, oh, I'm going to read Emily's work because I want to figure out something about writing from it. It's just, oh, reading a bunch of her stuff, this stuff sort of percolates through.
I think that's really undervalued because there's no tangible result, or at least no quick fix, but stuff will percolate. That's actually that one fiction book that I'm within reach of. I keep my, I got To Kill a Mockingbird, I've got Pride and Prejudice, I've got anthology of Stephen Crane, Bluebeard by Kurt Vonnegut, but this shelf is worky things. So it's mostly on writing or references or, whatever I'm developing lessons on right now. But this one is just a favorite because I picked it up and I was like, what? You can do that with words? And I don't write like Daniel Handler. He's hilarious. I'm not funny. But he just uses language differently than I had ever encountered before. And that's why it's so special to me. I mean, it's also very good. It's a lie. It says it's a novel and it is not a novel. It's a series of vignettes, but really long vignettes.
I mean, if you ask my students, literally everything is a novel. The number of times I've gotten things about Shakespeare plays or Milton poems as novels and essays is uncountable. So that's more of a novel than
All right.
those are.
I accept, but it's just there's something really powerful about encountering something new. So I'm glad that you said that. So what are some just flipping away back to the academic questions? You mentioned, I'm gonna pretend there was an actual segue rather than a pre-prepared question. You mentioned John Donne, and one of my professors in university was I don't know, president, whatever the positions are of the John Donne Society. So I was like, can I reach my Donne? But I have a ton of Donne anyway. I can't hold it in my hand. Are there any like secret communities that you're part of with your Shakespeare work? And I say secret, I know it's probably not a secret on your end, but like, I didn't know there was a John Donne Society.
Right. So
I also find him very hard to read. I keep looking for sexual innuendo, and I'm like, I don't get it. This isn't sexy.
I mean, sometimes there is. The Flea is full of it.
Right.
It's all about how our blood is going to commingle inside of a flea, which is all about commingling different bodily fluids. But
anyway, John Donne is sexy, and I don't get it.
If you've seen some of his portraits, anyway, you know, like I am part of the big organizations, which are, you know, probably a secret from the non-academic end, like Shakespeare Association of America. Is, you know, it's literally not open to people who aren't working on Shakespeare in some sense, although you can be an independent scholar and join. But you know, it's got thousands of members, but I would still say it's probably fairly secret in the larger world.
I didn't know it existed until this moment.
Yeah, but a couple of the groups I'm actually a member of as well, that have been really helpful for me are actually sort of these small regional Shakespeare conferences that operate every year. They have a little conference, and sometimes they publish like a little book of proceedings, which are, you know, small peer-reviewed articles. So the Ohio Valley Shakespeare Conference in particular, but also the Southeastern Renaissance Conference, are just these great places where academics come together and sort of all participate in the same panels. Like there'll be at most sort of like one or two panels at a time. You know, big conferences like Shakespeare Association will have dozens of panels at once, and so you can only go to one, and you really sort of only get to experience that thing. Whereas these smaller conferences are sort of groups for people to all go to the same presentations and hear these same people talking about the same stuff, and then, you know, have lunch together, talk about it, you know, get coffee with someone whose paper you liked, what have you. Now, obviously, COVID has put some damper on some of those activities, but those have been really great, and they're really, if you are someone who wants to go into academia, you know, obviously the Ohio Valley Shakespeare Conference is going to be mostly for people who are Shakespeareans and other Renaissance scholars, but there will be equivalents of that in any field. There's going to be these little sort of micro conferences, which, you know, they usually function by running a conference. So you pay the dues, you go to the conference, and that's the activity. But they are also sort of larger communities as well, because they're the same people year after year. So, you know, I've gone to the Ohio Valley Shakespeare Conference, I think 3 of the last 5 years, and I've gotten to actually know some people through that, and, you know, make connections through that kind of thing. So that's the kind of secret society level of at least on my end of academia.
I mean, I didn't know any of that stuff existed. I mean, of course, I'm not in any way surprised that there are conferences on Shakespeare. Like, I knew that happened. But it led me to thinking that, you know, at a big conference, you're going to hear from names that you've already heard from, or you've already experienced, or you know, maybe what they're saying is groundbreaking, but it's not something you're going to miss. Like, it's going to be in the news if you're in that realm. Where if you're going to a smaller conference, you're going to hear ideas that you maybe haven't heard, and you're going to be able to you know, be part of the conversations that are happening actively. And that's really cool. That's not something, I mean, being part of the Collins Writers Conference, you know, I have a lot of strong feelings about small regional conferences. But that's a generative conference, right? Not a research conference, not an academic conference. And that's exciting. It's exciting. I'm getting excited about academia, and I'm not in it, and will probably never go to that conference. I guess, oh shoot. I'm running low on time, and I haven't asked you any of my like obvious questions yet. So please bear with me. I usually ask them either first or last, and the moment that I'm going to first ask you the question I would usually ask at the very beginning, and then I'm going to ask you the question I would usually ask at the very end. When did you start to consider yourself a writer?
So that's got multiple layers to it. I have always been willing to write, and actually more willing in retrospect than I thought I was to share my writing as well. I was writing sonnets in high school that I shared with people. I was writing even before that, although most of that is either in a trunk in my parents' house or gone. My wife found a lovely thing I wrote at age, I think, 4, about how my life is very precious to me. I do not want to lose it, but I know that all people must die, which was one of the creepiest things to realize you were thinking about at 4 years old.
Yeah. Especially
I
as a
think there's a
parent, I
different answer
imagine.
to the fundamental question of when I thought of myself as a writer for academic writing and creative writing, right? Academic writing was very much once I first presented at a conference, once I sort of had someone who wasn't me or my advisors looking at the writing, I was suddenly sort of very aware of myself as a writer for academic purposes. And that would have been 2012, I think. And then, my first article was a couple years later than that. And that was also sort of like, oh, this is a thing now. Whereas creative writing kind of snuck up on me more. I honestly don't think I would have thought of myself as a creative writer until maybe until I started actually publishing those, which is much more recent. I competed in a sonnet contest when I was a study abroad student, like in 2007, but I would not have thought of myself as a writer, despite the fact that I was, writing things and submitting them to contests. I kept a blog in which there are thousands and thousands of sonnets, and I still don't think I would have thought of myself as a writer until they started appearing places that weren't self-published on the internet. So
That's why I asked this question. This is one that I ask of almost everyone, because it's part of that gatekeeping thing, right? For whatever reason, none of us feel worthy of the title of writer, which is crazy to me. I'm the same way, or I was the same way. It took some real work to get myself to call myself a writer, even though like I would tell someone else that they are a writer. So that's why I like that question. The follow-up is why formal poetry?
So I mentioned a little bit of this earlier in terms of the way it connects with my academic interests, but it's just the way I think. Like when I am trying to express, I mostly write formal lyric poetry, right? And one of the things I try to emphasize to my students is that lyric poetry is usually the expression of sort of one idea, one thought, one emotion in words, and ideally in a way that other people can understand. and so when I tried to sort of express emotion and thoughts, love, loss, things like that, it always sort of just naturally lines itself up into, if it's going to come out at all, and often, of course, it doesn't. None of us are constantly perfectly writing, right? But it lines itself up in rhyme. It lines itself up in meter. I used to do a trick back in college and grad school of sort of a bar table trick of, give me a napkin and a minute and I will write you a sonnet, like, very, very quickly. Like that's just sort of always been the way my mind just sort of lines up. If I'm thinking of poetry, it will line up sort of naturally into meter and rhyme, and it's actually very difficult for me to write unrhymed poetry intentionally. Or rather, I can do it when it's intentional, but it's very hard for me to do it sort of instinctively. It doesn't happen naturally.
That's wild. I used to make this argument totally, absolutely counter to what you just said, which is that Shakespeare must have accidentally been writing in such even pace, which clearly I was wrong.
Well, I mean, you could say that I'm accidentally writing in it, right? Like, I'm not sitting there usually. I mean, sometimes when you get like 10 lines into a 14-line sonnet, you start being like, oh, I really need to massage these last 4 lines to actually get to the point of the poem at the end. But it's not that I'm sitting down and being like, okay, I'm going to intentionally have this come out this way. Like, it very much is accidental, sort of like, that's how it comes out. Like, what, and once you write enough like that, it keeps doing, like, that faucet doesn't turn off.
My brain does not do trochees.
Yeah. So like, you see, I think Shakespeare honestly must have just been like, just sort of at that point, like, again, some of the plays do have a bunch of prose in them, but like for the characters where he's writing it in verse, it must have been sort of automatic almost, because you can't write that many plays at that length without it sort of turning into a natural habit.
I'm glad that you rephrase. I feel like I phrased it really clumsily and you fixed it. Thank you. That's so crazy. That is just totally mind-blowing to me. But that comes naturally to you. I couldn't even ever do scansion well, because I'm just like, I don't know. This is how I talk.
Right. I mean, honestly, one of the things that was really helpful for me when I started thinking about formal poetry, something I learned from, I think, my first theater director in Shakespeare, Shauna Bestock, God love her, who's still teaching theater in Seattle, was that actually people naturally speak in something that sounds like iambic pentameter. If you really, if you let someone speak at length and fluidly, it'll usually fall into a rhythm of kind of iambic pentameter. And so that was really helpful for me in performance of Shakespeare, right? Because it helps you think of it flowing naturally, even though it's lines on the page. But it's actually also very helpful for me in terms of writing formal meter, because sentences actually can be pretty even. You don't have to artificially wrench something to get into a 10-syllable line. You just need to say or write something that is 10 syllables long. And
then just make a new line.
Yeah, exactly.
You're blowing my mind with things that I feel like I was always 2 steps away from figuring out. Like you can tell a strained performance because the person is clearly trying to talk as though they're reading poetry, and that's not those are the performances you want to go to. I had one of our interns was here to use Wi-Fi and was watching, and I don't know what the production was. It was Much Ado About Nothing. There it is. And it was the 90s version.
Ken Branagh, Emma Thompson, Denzel Washington.
Yeah.
One. Yeah.
Yes.
Love that one.
Thank you. And there was some character who was doing an English accent, and I was like, this is too weird. Like, this is coming off very stilted. Just let him talk. Like, I want to say it was Denzel Washington. Maybe it was like Keanu Reeves. I don't know. I don't remember.
It might have been Michael Douglas. There's a lot of people in there who don't naturally have English accents.
I was happy to be as spellbound as ever by Emma Thompson, though. I love her so much. But whoever it was, I was like, this person should not be having an accent. Like, why? Who decided on that? Because whoever it was is a really good actor, and it was just like slowing them down and making them sound really formal and unnatural. And I've seen that play, and I've seen it done. And after watching that movie, they then watched the Joss Whedon, in which everyone is speaking really fast and haphazardly, because it's the play's about getting laid.
Right.
And that's you made that connection for me about why, like, particularly like high schoolers, right, will be stilted when they're performing poetry. or when they're performing Shakespeare, who is of course a poet. But thank you. Now I'm spelling it out for other people for their sake, not my own. And then the final question. We're at 2:00. That's my fault. I started us late. I babbled a lot. Why Shakespeare?
I mean, for me, that's a very complicated question and one I keep trying to answer, right? In different ways for different audiences. One of the reasons for me of why Shakespeare is, why I write about Shakespeare, why I read Shakespeare, is that, I really love his artistry. Like Shakespeare's Political Imagination is the name of my book, and it's because I really feel like with Shakespeare we can see the way he transforms things and the way he thinks about things when he's writing them. And obviously we're psychoanalyzing a guy who's 400 years dead, but the sort of the artistry on form, not so much of they're the best plays that have been ever written. Like, I think I'd probably rather watch Tom Stoppard's Arcadia than a lot of Shakespeare plays. But that just the techniques and the approaches he does are so interesting. And there's all this cultural capital, right? We can't ignore the fact that for 400 years, people have been reading Shakespeare. And so you've got a whole conversation to be part of, and you've got all these other people who've written about him and other people who've studied him and other people who've performed him. It's unparalleled, right? So, I don't ever really want to sit there and say Shakespeare is the greatest writer who ever wrote in English, because I think that's a really big assumption about the ability to say that anyone is the greatest writer who ever wrote in English. But in a lot of ways, I think Shakespeare is, if not one of the most interesting writers in English to write about, because of his artistry and because of the sort of momentum that has built up with his work over the years and the conversation you get to be a part of.
Yeah, I love that your answer to why Shakespeare is because you also want to know why Shakespeare. I got a little distracted at Tom Stoppard. I haven't read Arcadia, but of course, as a human being who loves people who love theater and who love Shakespeare, I have of course engaged with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is so fun. Like,
it's a brilliant play.
It kind of pisses you off. It's so fun. Maybe you're not like me. Maybe you don't get angry when you have fun. So I'm excited to think about that too. I spoke with someone, I know I'm supposed to be like closing up right now, but I spoke with someone once who had plans of doing a sort of an in the round with Hamlet and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in real time, which I'm sure lots of people have engaged with that idea. But
I think it's more common to see it in repertory, where you'll do Hamlet one night with the same actors and then Rosencrantz and Guildenstern the next night with the same actors. I don't think it's as common to try to do it at the same time.
Yeah, that would be something. And a very long night.
Yes.
Very long night.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you for blowing my mind. I feel like I'm ready to go learn things. Very, very grateful for that. Do you have a favorite or a line that comes to mind often for you from Shakespeare?
I think Richard III is probably my favorite Shakespeare play, and for various reasons that I don't want to psychoanalyze myself for, because it's a horrible person. But right now in Iowa, although today was nice, I do tend to think that now is the winter of our discontent is particularly appropriate. Although remember that the line immediately after it is "Made glorious summer by the son of York." So it's not actually about winter. It's about things that ought to be wintry not actually being wintry.
Beautiful. You let me do exactly what I wanted to do, which is today's free write is going to be based on that, and I'm going to do updates at the Midwest Writing Center, and then I'm going to get the free write prompt. Like Philip said, right now we've got our bespoke poetry program going on. Today is the deadline if you want to have a romantic poem for your sweetheart. We have a little Google form that you fill out, and then one of our really fantastic poets will write you a poem to your specifications for your sweetheart. But also, if it's not Valentine's themed, if you don't have that Valentine's deadline, we ask for 5 days notice before for turnaround on your poem. But the deadline to get your form to us is March 12th. And bespoke means custom made. So these poems are written on demand to your specifications by some really, really talented folks. We've got a stable of really, really talented poets. Other things coming up, we've got the Iron Pen contest. That's based off the Iron Man exercise, right? So you've got 24 hours to flex those writing muscles. So starting on February 25th at 5 p.m., that's a Friday, we give you a fresh prompt, which you then have 24 hours to write your best fiction, poetry, or nonfiction, or all three. Turn that in at 5 p.m. on the 26th. Then we'll have an awards ceremony at which anyone who participates can read. Anyone who participates, who registers at all, even if you decide the prompt isn't your thing, is entered to win free tuition to the Collins Writers Conference, which is going to be so fantastic. We're booking that faculty now, and what we've got lined up already is so great. I'm really, really pumped. Of course, I'm starstruck all the time. So maybe if you don't trust my taste in writing, you'll disagree, but you should. I read a lot. We also, winners, anyone who places in the Iron Pen contest is offered publication opportunity in our online literary magazine, Writer's Block. So today is also the last day to sign up for the Heart Work of Writing, a generative writing workshop with Tanea Winder. That is a 6-week, once a week program, which is $90 for members, $120 for non-members. It's going to be really, really excellent. It's for women and femmes only, so that we can have a safe space to really generate whatever it is that's going to come out. So you can always feel okay with sharing, and also, talk about things that maybe specifically affect sensitive topics. In April, we're going to have a flash fiction workshop called A Crash on Flash, like a crash course, with Audra Kerr Brown, I believe. I don't have that in front of me. I just have the name of the workshop, but so I may be pronouncing it wrong, but that the instructor is pretty prolific with flash writing. The short form is really taking off right now. Brevity is a really great skill to have. Yeah, we're going to be, as always, the first and third Saturday of the month from 11 to 1. I host a workshop group that's on Zoom. It's really fun. I really enjoy it. We try to give feedback based on what you need from your writing, not our own personal taste, which should help us all to become better writers in the way that we want to be. If you are leaving us now, please, as always, write more light into your life. If you are interested in our prompt, which I am going to be doing off camera so as to not take up anyone else's time. It's pretty awkward watching myself write on screen anyway, but we're going to take that line from Philip, from Richard III. Now is the hour of our discontent, and or now is the hour of our, now is the winter, God, now is the winter of our discontent. That just entirely changes the meaning. It's an hour of discontent. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by our King of York. Is that right?
Son of York.
Son of York. Listen, I thought it was an hour of discontent. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by our son of York. I've put that in the comments of the live video. I would like you to, write whatever moves you. But if you need further direction on how to do this free write, often I journal on, what does this mean? But maybe as Philip was saying, we talk about what is this winter made glorious summer? What does that mean to me? What poetry can I write in response to this? What narrative can I write in response to this? Now, set your 5-minute timers and write more light into your life. Thank you. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, audience.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, we're still live.